All right, so here's this video over cellular respiration. Just give me an intro. I'm not going to go too many into the different stages of cellular respiration, and hopefully enjoy the video, and shouldn't be too long. So there might be something I have you watch at the end, so make sure you kind of watch the whole thing. You can see this image right here of the process. We're going to break down each individual part, but right now we're going to look mainly at kind of the warm-up or background information necessary. When you think about cellular respiration, you got to realize it doesn't matter if you're talking about an orangutan, a panda, or a baldwin for that matter. Every living thing has to get energy from an outside source. Now, plants are going to get their energy from the sun. Some organisms are going to be able to generate their own energy. Others are going to have to eat those things that eat energy, or things are going to eat things that eat things that eat energy. And we talked about all of that already. We talked about the trophic levels and how you lose energy. What we're going to talk about is how does this guy get energy from the things he's eating? How do the baldwins, I don't know what they eat, maybe souls, who knows, right? Just kidding. Hopefully I don't get sued for that, baldwins. But anyways, we'll see how they get their energy. When you look at this, energy flows in the ecosystem. We've talked a little bit about how that occurs, and you can kind of pause this and write some of this stuff down. But the idea is that the photosynthesis does two things. This is has to go back into the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis makes oxygen and organic materials. Those are going to be used in cellular respiration. Then in cellular respiration, they're going to take the energy and organic material, make ATP. That ATP is going to be available to do work in the cell, to allow the cell to grow and develop and so on. Okay. Organic materials, they're going to store energy in the, they're going to store their energy in potential energy in the forms of the bonds of the glucose, which is going to be then used to make ATP. I'm going to switch it now, so if you want to write this down, go ahead and pause it now. And here we can really see this. This is just basically kind of like a carbon cycle where light energy is going to be taken in the photosynthesis, producing organelles, the chloroplast. And in here, which we've already covered, we're going to make some organic material. Usually glucose is a good example of what we use. Remember from last chapter, that's not really what's produced at the end of the Calvin cycle, but that's why we use the word organic material. Some oxygen's produced. This plays into mitochondria, where ATP is going to be actually generated through a series of different reactions. Those end products, CO2 and oxygen, can then be reused by a plant to make more. All right, so the actual catabolic pathway here, when we think about it this way. A catabolic pathway is simply a metabolic pathway, and its job is to release energy. And it does that by taking more organized, more complex things with more bonds. Those bonds have potential energy. They're going to break those bonds or reduce those bond number, therefore converting potential energy into kinetic energy, allowing it to be available work. And cellular respiration is the most common, most efficient, and the easiest for us to understand, and that's why we're going to use that. And in this process, basically, oxygen is going to be consumed along with organic material. At the end of the day, it's simply a reaction that involves some type of organic compound. With that, we're going to add oxygen. Okay, now this important thing, we've got to put enzymes and all that on here. We're going to get as a result carbon dioxide, water, and energy in some form. Take that away, and really this is just summarizing what I just said. Notice the most common form is in the form of ATP. An important number here is the actual energy that we're going to get is 686. Oops, I wrote that wrong. 686. Apologize for the bad handwriting on my iPad. I'm trying to write with the tip of my finger, which isn't working out too well. There we go. So in this process, what's going to end up happening is we're going to break down organic material, and that reaction is going to be an exergonic reaction. And so when you think about exergonic, it's better than exothermic. Thermic refers to heat, gonic has to refer to energy, so that's a better term we like to use. One of the ways we do that is through a fermentation process. We make wines and beers and things like that out of that.
Jordan Morris.
And in doing so, we end up making, like I said, without oxygen. It's not required. What we're going to focus in on is when it requires oxygen, which is cellular respiration. Now, an important thing is, although carbohydrates and fats and proteins are all consumable as fuel, so I always get pissed when my general biology guys tell me proteins are used for fuel, and they hear that from PE class. Yeah, it is, but they're enzymes. They're important in structure. They're a lot more than just that. But all those things, carbs, fats, and proteins, could all be what we use to understand this pathway. But for the easiness of understanding, the easiest one to follow is through cellular respiration through sugar, specifically glucose, and that's why we're going to do that. And at the end of the day, it's this redox reaction, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. All right, a chemical reaction that transfers electrons between the reactants, we called it oxidation redox reaction, or simply a redox reaction. And we're going to look at that here now. Let me enlarge this, turn it, there we go. So what ends up happening is, in an oxidation, the substance that loses electrons is oxidized. In a reduction, the substance that gains electrons, or in the process is reduced the amount of positive energy. That's where that term comes from when people say, well, why do you call it, if it's gaining, why is it a reduction? Well, it's gaining electrons, which in the process is reducing the positive charge. Okay? In this, you got to remember a couple things. The electron donor is called the reducing agent. The electron receptor is called the oxidating agent. Okay? You can kind of see that down here, what's going on. Becoming oxidized, it loses electron, gains the electron. One of the things, if you have Mr. Dow, you might remember the expression oil rig, right? And you think about that oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. Sometimes in a redox reaction, there's not actually a transfer of electrons, but what ends up happening is the change of the electron that are actually involved in the sharing of the covalent bonds, excuse me. A good example of a redox reaction of this process is when methane and oxygen actually interact and react. That's when you get a flame, is a good example of this. When there's that exchange or transfer, not necessarily the gain. If you remember this phrase, oil rig, it'll help you. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain, or the reduction of. And here you can look at specifically this process. I'll blow that up if you want to write it. I'm going to pause it. I'd say this part up here is kind of the key component up here. What's being reduced when we look at methane? There's methane, there's the oxygen. It's becoming oxidized. This is becoming reduced in the process. When we look specifically at organic materials now, there's our glucose molecule right here, there's our oxygen. Oxygen is being reduced in the process, and the CO2 is the oxidizing agent in this, okay? The fuel, glucose, is oxidized and oxygen is being reduced. All right. In this process of cellular respiration, the glucose and other organic materials, we're going to break these down in a series of steps. I'm not going to be big that we know each of the individual steps, but you are going to need to know kind of the major events that happen in each one of these stages, if there's important enzymes and things like that, and what's going to be the acceptor of the process, who are going to be the electron carriers, where's the ATP going to be generated and synthesized. So that's what we're going to focus in on in this unit. And here's actually that occurring. So when we go from an NAD through this process, the changing of electrons and how that's an actual electron carrier. NADH passes electrons into the electron transport chain. That's the big payoff. In NADH is like a IOU, and then we're going to cash it in at the very end. It is a series of reactions that happen in a series of steps. It's not one explosive step. And this helps kind of harness the energy available to do work. The energy in this process, the end product is going to be the conversion of ADP and inorganic phosphate to ATP using the enzyme ATP synthase. And you can kind of see that here. Notice the difference between the uncontrolled reaction. We'd lose a lot of heat and light, uncontrolled forms of energy or not very stable. In this process, cellular respiration, it's a slow release. It's a more controlled release of the energy into ATP that can be used by the cell. Cellular respiration does happen in steps, and I'll kind of write down each one of these. The first step is obviously glycolysis. The lysing or the splitting of the glucose, that's the first step. And the end result of this is you break that down into 2 pyruvates, okay? And I'm going to type this up here real quick because it's taking up way too much space and it's kind of messy. The second stage is the citric acid cycle. Its job is to complete the breakdown of glucose. And then lastly, the last stage is oxidation phosphorylation, also known as the electron transport chain, and this is where most of our energy is actually going to be generated. Glycolysis happens, notice, outside of the mitochondria. It happens in the cytosol or in the cytoplasm of the cell, and its job is to take glucose, convert it into pyruvic acid through a series of about 9 reactions, each step catalyzed by a different reaction. And in doing so, it does make some ATP and some electron carriers that will be used later. The next 2 stages happen within the mitochondria, the citric acid cycle. During the citric acid cycle, we're going to make some ATP. In the process, we're also going to produce some carbon dioxide, make some more electron carriers that'll feed into the last stage in the mitochondria. Last stage is simply oxidation phosphorylation, the electron transfer stage. In this place, this is where most of our ATP is going to be made, and we're going to take the electron carriers of glycolysis, citric acid cycle, feed them into here to make our ATP.